it's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Susan Berry, author of Fixing My Gaze and professor of biological sciences at Mount Holyoke College. Dr. Berry received her PhD in 1981 from Princeton University and has pursued her research in neuroscience at NASA's Johnson Space Center and the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole, among other institutions. So, in the summer of 2006, I listened to NPR's Morning Edition during my commute every day, and I remember hearing an interview with a neuroscientist who gained stereo vision in middle age, when everyone thought that could only be done in infancy. And she described the joy of seeing a snowfall in 3 dimensions for the first time, and I had to wipe my eyes a little on my way into the office. Not quite a year after that, I started dating a brilliant and beautiful woman who invited me to meet her family at their Passover Seder. And by the way, she said, my mom is a little obsessed with stereo vision. So, my mother-in-law, Dr. Susan Berry, Stereopsis.
Thanks, David, for that introduction. I think my daughter is brilliant, partly because she married you. Okay, so today I am going to tell you about the story in my book, which is a story about how I rehabilitated my own vision with the help of a developmental optometrist in a way that people thought, scientists, physicians thought was impossible. And to understand how that happened, you really have to go back and think about what it is that we use our vision for to begin with, okay? And to get at that question, I thought I'd show you a slide of an animal on the first slide. Does anyone know what this animal is? You guys need to get out from the building and go down to Cape Cod and scoop your hands under the pier, and you'll see these little animals that look sort of like a hot water bottle. This animal is called a tunicate, or a sea squirt. And they're actually in the chordate phylum, which is our phylum, so they're our distant cousins. And the reason I'm mentioning this animal to you is because when it's in its larval form, its juvenile form, it looks sort of like a tadpole, and it swims about, and it has 2 eyes and a brain. And then when it finds a suitable place to live, it literally sticks its head in the sand and converts itself to this adult form, which is simply a filter feeder. It just brings in water, sieves water right through its body, extracting the plankton from the water for its food. But it never uproots itself again. It just stays in one place for the rest of its life. And in the course of converting itself from this larval swimming form to the adult sessile form, it loses its eyes and most of its brain. Because you don't need eyes or much of a brain if you don't move. The major role of vision is allowing us to move. Think about it. Organisms that don't move, like plants, don't uproot themselves and move, like plants, don't have eyes and they don't have a brain. The major role of vision is to allow us to know where we are in space and where everything else around us is in space, so we can move accurately and manipulate those objects. Okay? So how do we know how to do that? Well, think about it if you only had one eye in the middle of your head, like a cyclops. Then I would know, for example, that I was looking out the window on my right because I've moved my one single cyclopean eye to the right. And I would know that I was looking, for example, at the projector more or less straight ahead because I have now moved my single eye to be straight ahead on my head. And my head is facing straight forward. But we don't have one eye, we have 2. And the fact that we have 2 eyes with overlapping visual fields makes the whole situation both more sophisticated but also more complicated. So I want you all to do this little experiment. Take your index finger and just put it a comfortable distance from your face, but straight ahead, straight in front of your nose. And now I'm going to ask you, you know you are looking straight ahead. You're looking at your finger, which is straight ahead. But it's either one of your eyes actually pointing straight ahead? Well, no. You've got one eye that is, your right eye is pointing a little bit to the left, and your left eye is pointing a little bit to the right. What is straight ahead is where the line of sight of the two eyes cross, as is shown in this picture here. And then if you follow these lines, and you imagine this target is the finger that you were just looking at, then you can see that the image of the finger is cast on the retina in the back of the eye, on the central part of the retina called the fovea. But it's cast on corresponding points of the two eyes. Okay? And so your brain makes a conclusion. It says, my finger, whose image was cast on corresponding points of the retinas of my two eyes, I have two images of that finger, one from my right eye, one from my left. But those two images are falling on corresponding points of the two retinas. And therefore, there is only one finger there, not two. And more important, it's located in one unique location in space. Okay? And similarly, if we look at this picture here, the two eyes are bifixating on the block. The image of the block falls on the same central part of both retinas. And these two toys here, the teddy bear and the rattle, are falling basically in the same frontoparallel plane as the block. And if you look to see where their image is cast, then you can see that, for example, the image of the teddy bear is cast to the right of that central region, and the same number of degrees to the right of the central region for the left and right eye. And so your brain will think, okay, I have two images of the teddy bear, one from my right and one from my left eye. But they're falling on corresponding retinal points. And therefore, there is only one teddy bear, and it's located in one unique location in space. And that location on the z-axis is roughly the same as the point where I'm fixating, where my two eyes are meeting, okay? Or the line of sight of the two eyes are meeting. So that all works perfectly well, as long as your two eyes point to the same place in space at the same time. But what happens if they don't? And that was my situation, because I've been cross-eyed all my life. So when I looked with one eye, the other eye turned in and looked someplace else. And I rapidly switched between which eye was looking, let's say, straight at you and which eye was turned in. So the two eyes were not pointing at the same place in time. And that makes figuring out where things are located in space and how many things there are out there a much more difficult situation. And in fact, there are two sort of major consequences of having misaligned eyes, having two eyes that are not pointing to the same place in space at the same time. And one is diplopia, or double vision, which I'll talk about in a little while. And the other is visual confusion, which is a term that was coined by the famous psychophysicist Helmholtz, the man who invented the ophthalmoscope and was brilliant in a bazillion different ways. He termed the term visual confusion, or he coined that term. And let me explain to you what it is.
Sorry, can I
Yeah.
ask you a question? So you're talking about having your two eyes not pointing
At the same place.
In the same direction, or not pointing at the same thing, right?
Right.
But assuming that the fields of vision still overlap, assuming that the skew is not so large to you, then you are getting an image of each of the two things, right? It's just that they're not both foveal, right? They're not both in the fovea. So is it really is there something kind of biologically intrinsic about the fovea that lets you know that that's where the two corresponding images should be? Do you not make up?
It's your reference point. It's your reference point. It's the center of the retina for both eyes. It's where you have the greatest number of photoreceptors. It's where the visual cortex is paying the most attention. So it's your reference point. This is the same place in both eyes. And then, like I showed you in this picture here, if we use the fovea then as our reference, then where other images fall relative to the fovea on both eyes becomes important.
Right.
And when you say, is this innate biological, I mean, that seems to be the way it works.
So you don't make up for it by picking some other point as your reference point and having use the fovea in one eye and use some ex-foveal point as the reference.
Actually, that is an adaptation that can develop in people with a long-term strabismus, and it's called anomalous correspondence. And that allows you to kind of use both eyes and look through both of them at the same time, even though they're looking at different things. But yeah.
A standard way of dealing with it.
It's not, and it's also not the first way of dealing with it. It's an adaptation that develops over time. Right. Yes?
And when you do that, you pick a different point, but it's always the same point?
Well, that would be if it's harmonious anomalous correspondence. And that would depend upon the fact that your two eyes are always misaligned to the same degree, whether you're looking close or you're looking far, which is called comitant strabismus. If your strabismus is incomitant, meaning that and mine was incomitant, meaning that my eye misalignment was different looking close than further away, then it's harder to develop an anomalous correspondence because the two eyes are not in the same relationship with each other, looking close and far.
I'll take a guess here and say that if you get harmonious, you get stereo, and if you don't get harmonious...
You may have some crude stereo vision with harmonious correspondence, but because images that fall outside of the fovea are less well resolved and are seen less well, it's not the same as combining two foveal images, or even combining two parafoveal images, but that are falling at the same place parafoveally. The two images aren't identical. Yeah, but you're getting at, right from the get-go, some of the complications and subtleties of strabismus, which most scientists and physicians actually don't go so far as to think about. And so they think, oh, strabismus, easy to understand. They use one eye and suppress the other, end of story. And now you're seeing it's really actually much, much more complicated than that. Okay, so anyway, we've got the situation where the two eyes are pointing at different places in space. And I was telling you there are two consequences of that: diplopia, which means double vision, and visual confusion. So let's start with visual confusion. And what I want you to think about is this. Here's the left eye. It is fixating on the rattle. The rattle is falling on the fovea, the central part of this retina. Here's the right eye. It's turned in. Its fovea is not looking at the rattle. Its fovea is looking at the block. The default way that the brain works is to say that the two foveal images must be in the same spatial location, the same place in space. So if one eye is foveating the rattle and the other eye is foveating the block, the result is you see the rattle and the block in the same place in space, which, as you can see, would be a fairly untenable situation. And you might also think, well, that's kind of interesting, but I could never experience that myself. But actually, if you do have two reasonably good eyes and reasonable binocular vision, we can all experience visual confusion with the hole in the hand experiment. Has anyone ever done this? It's great cocktail party fodder. So do you all have a piece of paper? If you don't, I can give you one. Okay, so what I want you to do is take the piece of paper, roll it up at about the diameter of a toilet paper roll so that you can put your right eye through it and look through it as in I spy. And then go ahead and look at me for a second. I want you to take your left hand, put the tube over the right eye and put the left hand so that it is toward the very end of the roll of paper. Not over it, so it blocks your view through the right eye, but next to it. Open both eyes and tell me what you see. Do you see the hole in the hand?
I don't have stereo vision.
Yeah. But did many of you see something that looked like this? A hole in the middle of your hand. Was anyone in pain? So think about what's happening there. The central part of one eye is seeing the hole through the tube. The central part of the other eye can't see that because of the tube, and it sees the middle of the hand. And so your brain says, well, the central part of one eye is seeing a hole, the central part of the other eye is seeing the hand. Since corresponding retinal points are seeing these two different things, they must be in the same place in space, and you see the hole in the middle of your hand. And so that's an example of visual confusion. Obviously an artificial one, but it's probably the most detrimental consequence of strabismus, is this overlap of things in visual space, which makes obviously moving through space very difficult. Okay? And then, of course, the second consequence of misaligned eyes is double vision, which some people may have experienced if they drank a little bit too much. Maybe not in this crowd. And let's figure out how double vision works. Again, think about the rattle. Its image is cast on the fovea of one eye. But if the second eye is turned, that image is now falling on a non-foveal point, okay? On a different place on the retina of the other eye. And so the brain says, I have two images of the rattle, one from my right and one from my left eye. They're not falling on corresponding points. So maybe there are two rattles. And they're located in two separate locations in space. And that, of course, is double vision. Okay, so when I was a child, my strabismus, my crossed eyes, also called infantile exotropia, developed within the first months of life. And as a result, I adapted fairly rapidly to the strabismus. Or maybe I didn't adapt fairly rapidly because my parents told me I was a really difficult infant and toddler. But I adapted, and the way I adapted was to suppress the input from one eye. So I would look with one eye and turn in the other. And pay attention to the input from the straight eye and essentially suppress or ignore the input from the turned eye. And so I do not remember many incidences of seeing double as a child or as an adult before I underwent my vision therapy. But there are people who develop strabismus, misaligned eyes, later on in life and may be plagued with a continual double vision. They always see images as double. And I was very curious as to what this was like. And I had a student with exactly this situation. And so one day over coffee, I asked her how it was that she coped. And I want to read to you from a section from my book about what she said. And so it goes like this. One of my students, Sarah, developed a form of strabismus when she was 5 years old and began to experience constant double vision in high school. I wanted to know how she coped, so one day over coffee I asked Sarah what her view of the world was like. She said, I see two images, but only one is real. I could be driving and see two images of a car, but I know which one to steer around. This sounded bizarre, not to mention dangerous, so I asked her how she knew. Sarah thought about this for a moment as she tried to put into words what came automatically to her. Then she said that the car image seen by her right eye was in context. In other words, the right eye image of the car was located relative to other things in her surroundings. To Sarah, it had a defined location in space. She added that in class, she might see two images of me at the blackboard. But again, only the right eye image was real. I was curious, does my voice come from the image of me seen by the right or left eye? Sarah hesitated, but said that the voice came from the image seen by the right eye. If I were to shake hands with you, she added, I could reach accurately for and shake only the hand seen by the right eye. If I tried to use the left eye image, I'd miss your hand. It's not that I think about this. I just reach for your hand automatically using the right eye image. I pointed to the coffee mug in front of her. From which of your two coffee cup images does the delicious coffee aroma come from? Now that you mention it, she said, it only comes from the cup image seen by the right eye. So think about what Sarah had to do. She had two images of everything. She has to interact with the world. One of those images had to be the interactable image with. One of those images had to be the one that she reached for or moved around, and so on. And so her brain sort of unconsciously made a decision about which of those images was the real image. And that was the image that was imbued with all the other physical characteristics, like the smell coming from the coffee cup or the voice coming from me as I was talking in front of the class. And again, you might say that real-unreal dichotomy, that seems pretty bizarre. I can't imagine experiencing it. But we can all experience that too, or many of us can who have reasonable binocular vision. And here's the trick. So take your hand again, hold up your index finger and put it in front of your face. But this time, don't look at it. Look at me or look further in the distance. Can you get a double image of your finger? Okay? That's called physiological diplopia. It's absolutely normal. It's because you're fixating further away, so your finger image is falling on disparate parts of the two retinas. Perfectly normal. Okay? So now, get that double image again, and then very quickly take your right hand and try to grab both of those images. Keep looking in the distance. If you look at the finger, it'll single out. So keep looking in the distance. So I'm seeing a little bit of this, and then, or maybe this over here. Do you see what I'm getting at? Even though you're not walking around with continual double vision, when placed with the task of grabbing your finger, when you have two images of it, your brain automatically selected one of those images as real. One of those images as manipulatable. One of those images is the one you could grasp. And that's sort of the decision that Sarah had to make on a continual basis until she went to see my optometrist and went through optometric vision therapy, and now her double vision is largely resolved and she's in optometry school. So anyway, these are some of the consequences of having crossed eyes. And of course, the third consequence is a lack of binocular vision, is a lack of stereo vision. The ability, for example, to enjoy 3D movies. I made this slide before Avatar and the big 3D movie phenomenon sort of came along. Many of you have probably used Viewmasters, and you have a sense of what I mean when I say seeing in 3D. I had 3 operations on my eyes as a child to make them straighter. And although the operations made my eyes look straighter, it didn't really change the way I used them. I still continued to look with one eye and turn in the other. It's just now the eye turn was more subtle, so most people didn't notice it. But I remember after my 3rd operation being given a Viewmaster, and everyone else in the family seemed to really enjoy looking into it, and I had no idea what they were seeing. I mean, Mickey Mouse and Superman looked cute inside the Viewmaster, but I didn't really understand what it was they were seeing, because I still continued to see the image as flat, because I was really basically paying attention to the input from only one eye. Okay, so how does stereopsis, or the ability to see in 3D, work? Real quickly, again, it has to do with a comparison between the images on the two retinas. So let's say your eyes are looking at the point called fix. Then its image is falling on corresponding retinal points. Now take a look at target. That image is not in the same frontoparallel plane as fix, but it's either somewhere, in this case, it's behind it. Although we could do an analogous analysis if it were in front of the point called fix. Follow the dotted lines and look to see where that image is cast on the two retinas. And you can see that that image is not cast on corresponding points. This distance x is a number of degrees from the fovea of the left eye. That's different than this distance y, or angular distance y, number of degrees from the fovea on the right eye. And then your brain makes a new interpretation. The two images are falling on non-corresponding points. There's only one image out there. It must be in some unique location in space. And by dint of how it falls on one retina relative to the other, it assigns it a place in space that's either in front or behind the other image. And of course, that's what happens when you go to a 3D movie. You're wearing glasses that present images seen from slightly different perspectives, as if they were seen from your two eyes. And your brain then makes that interpretation. Oh, the image is a little different on the two retinas, and therefore it's either located in front or behind the fixation point. Okay? So that's basically how 3D vision works. And obviously, if you don't point your two eyes at the same place in space, if the eyes are misaligned, you're not going to see in 3D. And operations to fix the, or to try and realign the eyes may not work. Why may they not work? Because, think about this. Think about an infant. A child, by the age of 1 year, has already learned how to use their eyes to reach for things. You start reaching for things at about the age of 3 or 4 months of age, which incidentally is the same period of time when infantile esotropia, crossed eyes, first develops. Makes sense. If you're trying to reach for things and the eyes are not well aligned, you're going to have to do something about it. And one thing you could do is maybe your eyes are just a little bit misaligned. But now, if you misalign one of the eyes even more, cross it in even more, it's easier to ignore its input. So by the time you're a year old, you know how to reach for things. You have been looking at things from a lying down position, a sitting position. Perhaps you're cruising around and walking. Your visual habits have become embedded by the time you're a year old. And that's why I think surgery on its own can't fix the problem. Because in order for you to learn how to use your eyes in a different way, that is, point them at the same place at the same point in time, you have to be taught. This is something you learn naturally within the first year of life. But after that period of time, if you've developed different visual habits, you have to learn it in a whole new way. Okay? So that's the situation that I was in.
Why do some people block out the second eye?
You know, actually, I'll tell you an interesting adaptation that I used. So when I went to see a developmental optometrist at the age of 48. I didn't go to see her to gain stereo vision. The dogma was that if you didn't develop stereo vision within early childhood, what was called the critical period in early childhood, your brain wired itself up in a way that it couldn't rewire, and you were permanently stereoblind. And I had read all the papers supporting this idea, and I used to lecture about that in class. And I used to tell people, I'm an example that shows how well this theory of critical periods fits reality. I was cross-eyed since infancy. I'm stereoblind. Okay? But what I'm telling you is you develop certain adaptations, like you were asking, to be able to see. And I'll tell you one adaptation that I developed. I went to see my developmental optometrist because my gaze was jittery, especially in the distance. It was very hard to keep my eyes stable on anything. And so that's what I went to see her. I really wanted to have more confidence and competence for driving my children around town. I found it very difficult to drive. Look at a road sign and then go back to the road. It just was very hard. Okay? That's when I went to see her. And she told me how it was that I learned to read. So I had trouble learning to read in school. And it took me till about 4th grade to sort of catch up to what other kids were doing. And the way I learned to read was this way. When I looked at a book, I would look with one eye at the letters, and the other eye would turn in by 15 degrees, or 25 prism diopters. Why 15 degrees? Well, if you look at the eye, the image, let's say, of the letters from the eye that was doing the reading fell on the fovea. The other eye was turned by 15 degrees, so the image fell on the blind spot, on the place where the optic nerve leaves the retina and goes to the rest of the brain. So in other words, while one eye was looking at the letters, the other eye did not see those letters at all because the image of those letters fell on the blind spot. What a perfect adaptation. I can't really claim credit for it. It certainly wasn't a conscious thing, but that is eventually how I learned to read, but was by making this adaptation. And 15 degrees is a very common degree of eye turn for people with strabismus. And it makes sense. It puts the foveal image of one eye onto the blind spot of the other. A beautiful adaptation.
Takes away almost that double
It takes away almost the double vision, especially for what you're paying attention to, what's on the fovea. And you might say, well, if you can do that, why don't you just put the 2 images on the fovea? But the blind spot's a much bigger area, a much bigger target to aim for than the very tiny fovea. Okay? So
I had lateral strabismus when I was a child, when I was born, and I had an operation when I was 1 or something like that. It was very painless. I don't remember a thing about it. It went really well. But I still have a problem. I don't know if I have stereo vision or not, but I definitely notice sometimes I see double images. Sometimes my eye wanders when I'm really tired. And every once in a while, something will click, and it's like it's like I will bring the 2 images together and I'll know it. I don't know. It's like the second eye is aligning.
yeah, that's probably what's happening.
Okay, so that's.
Yeah, I have some tools you can try afterwards and see.
In 4th grade, it was horrible. So
Yeah,
maybe they've gotten better since then. So.
Well, you could probably tune it up.
Yeah.
You could probably tune it up. But yeah, I think your experience of the double vision or the eyes clicking in, that's an example of, getting them better into better alignment.
So why not do the surgery for infants instead of?
Well, the surgery is more successful if it's done on a child before the age of 1. Before, like I said, the visual habits become entrenched. But it's hard sometimes to catch a child at that young an age, and there's risks to doing surgery on a very young infant. And there may be, those are some of the issues. And usually surgery alone, if a child does develop stereopsis, stereo vision afterwards, it's not as good as the normal stereo vision. So vision training at the age when they would have been old enough to do it would still probably be recommended. Yeah, those are some of the issues out there. Okay, so then the question is, I've sort of explained to you the problem. And now I want to give you a little bit of an idea of the solution. How did my optometrist teach me to use my 2 eyes together, to point at the same place in space at the same time? And to do that, one of the tools that she used, and by the way, she was a developmental optometrist, which is a small set of optometrists who work on this optometric vision therapy to train binocular vision. And they're a very rare group of eye doctors, to be distinguished from ophthalmologists who do surgery. Okay, different types of eye doctors with different types of expertise. Okay, so one of the techniques that she used was developed by my hero, a man named Frederick Brock, who passed away in 1971. I never did meet him. But what Frederick Brock understood was that stereo vision, the ability to see with the 2 eyes, is not a passive process. For most of us, if you have normal binocular vision, when you look at something close, you automatically turn your 2 eyes in together, make a convergence movement, so that the image that's close, that you want to fixate, falls on corresponding retinal locations, on the fovea of both eyes. When you then shift your gaze to something further away, you turn out or diverge the eyes. These are vergence movements. They develop in children within the first 4 months of life. Or, if you're like I was and had infantile esotropia, they don't develop. Okay? And so I basically had to learn how to make vergence movements. I had to learn something that most people learn at 2 months of age, and I learned at the age of 48. And one of the tools that I used was developed by Frederick Brock, and I want to stress it's only one of many, but it was my absolute favorite, was the Brock string. And that's the string that you all have. Do you all have one? I have some others if there's somebody here who needs one. And then there's more if there's. Okay. So here's what you do. Take the bead on the Brock string, which is basically a household piece of string, and put it all the way to one end. The string should be about arm's length. Put the string up to the bridge of your nose and look at the bead. And hopefully you see one bead. But how many string images do you see?
6.
How many string images do any of you see 2 string images? Okay, now take the bead and put it in the middle of the string. And for some of you, it might be easier if the bead is closer to your nose, some further away. But put it about the middle of your middle of the string. Look at the bead again. Hopefully, again, you see it as single. And now, tell me, do you see something that looks like this?
Yep.
So you see a bead sort of in the middle of an X configuration, right? Where there are 2 images converging on the bead, and then 2 string images diverging away from it. Well, when I first began to do this exercise, I was overwhelmed because this exercise told me where my 2 eyes were pointing in space. It told me the line of sight of the 2 eyes. I didn't know which eye I was using at any one time. I didn't know how I used my eyes. I had to bring that information into conscious awareness in order to be able to change the way I moved my eyes. Okay? And this exercise gave me that information. So when you were looking at the bead, this string image was actually the image coming from your right eye, and this was the image coming from your left. And when I started the procedure, the only way I could get that double string image and the X was if the bead, and this is very common in somebody with my condition, infantile exotropia, the only way I could get the X is if I put the bead like practically up to my nose, within an inch of my nose. And then I could get the X image. And then I started gradually moving the bead further away from me, getting that X image, and keep going on. Sometimes I'd see only 1 image of the bead and 1 image of the string. What did that mean? I was suppressing 1 eye. Sometimes I saw both images of the string, but they weren't coming in at the bead. So I knew that I was turning on the input from both eyes, but they weren't aligned. But with this feedback, so simple, yet so elegant, I could learn how to point the 2 eyes at the same place in space at the same time. And I didn't stop with a little string like this. I ended up using an 11-foot string and with 5 beads along it. And I would look at the close bead and get the X, and then look at the further bead and the next bead, and so on and so on and so on. In this way, training my eyes to bifixate on different distances in space. And I still do these exercises on a regular basis while jumping on a trampoline or striding along on a Nordic track, because if I'm going to be binocular, I need to be binocular not just when I'm standing still, but when I'm moving. Okay? And I want to tell you about the time, I remember it was February 21st, 2002. I remember this day as if it were yesterday, when I was doing vision therapy at my developmental optometrist's office with a vision therapist. I did therapy for a year, 1 week for a year, once a week for a year, and practiced at home every day. And the exercise was to look at a close bead, and I had just gotten to the point where I could do that pretty well with a single bead, and now I had graduated to using 2 beads. And the therapist said, okay, look at the close bead. I said, yep, got it, got the X. Now she said, look at the further bead. And I worked at it, yep, I got the X. Now look at the close bead. Now look at the further bead. And I said to her, I can feel my eyes moving. I could feel them turning in to see the closer bead. I could feel them turning out together in coordination to see the further bead. I said to her, I feel my eyes moving. And she said, that's great. We'll do it a little longer, then we'll move on to another activity. And I said to her, no, I don't want to stop. I just want to keep doing this. I just want to feel the way this feels. I want to remember how this feels so I can use this when I don't have a Brock string with me. And it was that afternoon, after that vision therapy session, that I went out to my car and sat down in the driver's seat, and I looked at the steering wheel, and it was floating in front of the dashboard with this palpable volume of space between the steering wheel and the dashboard. And I had never seen anything like that before. And I thought to myself, could this be stereo vision? And then I thought, this is no way. I'm a neuroscientist. I know what I teach in class. It was the day after my 48th birthday. I was more than 40 years past the critical period for the development of stereopsis. This had to be something different. The sun was setting, and I thought, oh, the sun is casting the light into the car at an odd angle, and this must explain what's going on. Okay? But the next day, I went out to I did my vision therapy exercises in the morning, including the Brock string, and I went out to the car to drive to work, and I went to adjust the rear view mirror, and it was floating in front of the dashboard. And all that day, my vision began to change, and all that month. Well, there were many other vision therapy exercises that I did. I'm not going to go through them here now, because I just want to tell you, you can ask me some more about them afterwards if you'd like, because I just want to tell you what it's like to first see the world when you can point the two eyes at the same place in space at the same time. It was a remarkable change, one that I could never have predicted, that is certainly not in the textbooks where they sort of look at stereopsis as just a little frosting on the cake when it comes to vision. It completely transformed the way I saw. So take trees. All of a sudden, I could see, I always knew that trees, the canopy of a tree was round, right? But I never saw it that way. To me, a tree was like a kid's drawing. It was just flat looking when you looked at it, front on. And now, all of a sudden, I could see how the outer branches enclosed and captured whole volumes of space through which the inner branches came through. It was just absolutely spectacular. Snowfall. My first snowfall, David referred to that, was just unbelievable. My first snowfall in stereo. Because I could see how each flake occupied its own region of space, and there were these palpable pockets of space between one flake and another, and altogether they produced a beautiful three-dimensional dance. One of the things I mentioned to people, because people seem to relate to this, was my view of a mirror. In the past, when I looked at my reflection in a mirror, my image was on the plane of the mirror, not behind it. It was on the plane of the mirror, so much so that if there was a speck of dirt on the mirror, I thought it was on my clothes and would try to wash it away. And I remember the day when I looked in a mirror, and my image was no longer on the plane of the mirror, but somewhere behind it in reflected space. And that's when I understood what Lewis Carroll meant when he titled one of his books, Through the Looking Glass. When I look through a window now, instead of having the image just sort of flattened within the frame of the window, I now see it in 3 dimensions extending great distances beyond the window. That was a real revelation. And I am still confused by reflections. Because, if you're sitting, like one day I was sitting in a restaurant, and it was Christmas time, and I'm sitting here, and to my left, on the opposing wall of the restaurant was a bunch of lights, Christmas lights, which were reflected by the window onto the street outside. And I looked outside and I saw the reflected lights, not on the plane of the window, but somewhere out there in space. And I thought, why did they string Christmas lights in the middle of the street? And then, of course, I realized what was going on. I'm totally captivated by the way reflections have this 3-dimensional feel to them that I had never appreciated before. There were some surprising consequences of seeing in 3D that went beyond just that sense of depth, that sense of pockets of space between things. And one was that edges and objects, perhaps because now I could locate them so much more precisely, took on a sharpness and a definition that I'd never seen before. So take this painting, for example, by Ingres, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And take a look at the creases and folds in the princess's gown. I used to look at a painting like that and think, gosh, it's gorgeous. But nobody sees that way. Nobody actually sees the crinkles and the creases in such sharp definition. And then after my vision changed, yes, indeed, I did see them that way too. So edges and borders became much, much sharper. We have a way of understanding depth called motion parallax, which means that as you move like this back and forth, images close to you appear to move at a faster rate than images further away, and also in an opposite direction of images further away. And that gives you a sense of depth that you can see with one eye. But even that sense of depth was greatly enhanced when I had this special quality of stereo vision, of the pockets of space between things. And my peripheral vision improved. How? My awareness of things in the visual periphery improved. Why? Because when you're cross-eyed, your vision is inefficient. You're looking with one eye, you have to suppress the other. And so as a result, you take in less of the visual world. Once I resolve the conflict between the two eyes, because that's the major problem with strabismus, not lack of stereo, it's visual conflict between the two eyes. Once I resolve that conflict by pointing to two eyes at the same spatial location, then I could take in more of the visual periphery. And so when I'm driving, I now notice that there's a rear view mirror off to my upper right, which means that I tend to look at it more, which makes me a much better driver. And finally, I just want to add that many people will say to you, oh, you know, I understand what you're saying, it's all very cool, but if I do this, if I close one eye, the world doesn't look all that different. So I don't really understand why you think it's so wonderful, this stereo vision business. And I puzzled about that for a long time until the day, about 3 years after my vision began to change, when I went to see the last Star Wars movie, The Revenge of the Sith, with my kids and my husband. It was in 2005. And they insisted we go on midnight of the opening night, and I was not in the least bit interested. I mean, Star Wars was okay, but not worth staying up all night for, and being in a theater with screaming kids and all that, right? But my husband said this is a great family activity, so off we went at midnight to see the movie. And I'm looking at the movie, and I'm getting this incredible sense of the spaceships moving through space and volumes of space in the movie and all this sort of stuff. And I thought, wow, cinematography has really improved since the last Star Wars film. And it was only until I had had a good night's sleep that I realized, you know, cinematography wasn't all that different between Star Wars 5 and Star Wars 6. What had changed was my own visual perception. That sense of space and volume that I saw in the movie was due to, you know, clever tricks by the cinematographers using monocular depth cues and motion cues to evoke a sense of depth, to evoke a sense of space and volume. But I couldn't appreciate that deep sense of space and volume, which was suggested by the movie, until I had actually seen it in real life. And so when you just close one eye and you look out on the world, you still have a lifetime of stereo experiences to fill in that missing stereo information. But I never had that. And so when I first began to see in stereo, it was a radically different experience. And so I'll just end by saying that some of you may know, well, you probably don't know, my husband between 1992 and 2005 was an astronaut. He flew on the Space Shuttle 3 times. And his space launches were absolutely spectacular experiences. This is a photo of his first launch in 1996. It was a night launch. Incredible noise and lights and sounds, and you could feel the pressure waves of the shuttle. Amazing experience. But even that pales in comparison to first seeing in stereo depth. So, thank you. More questions?
So remind me, a retina moves with the eye, right? When you move the eye to look in different directions, the retina moves along.
Yes, it does. The nodal point of the eye, the turning point, is a little in front of the retina.
So the eye, the brain is actually using the eye position to figure everything out.
Yeah, and you know, that's been a very controversial subject, but they've now found areas in the brain that are monitoring the position of the eye. So they have found that, and there are receptors in the tendons of the eye called palisade endings, where there are sensory receptors for looking at how the eye is positioned in the orbit. And then, of course, your whole vestibular system in the inner ear is devoted to how is your head positioned on your neck, you know, and so yeah, it's very important for you to know where your eyes are.
Yeah, I was wondering. I mean,
Yeah,
the
as a,
retina was fixed and you moved just the lens
Right.
and the iris, and that would be
Right.
easier from an engineering standpoint.
yeah, yeah.
That's not how it works.
No, it's not. Yeah.
So it seems like, I always assume that you have two eyes, and then someplace back in here, there's a correlator that basically says yes, whenever whenever the two images fuse.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
And so listening to your talk here makes me wonder that if the young child whose eyes won't, the trouble is that the correlator is broken, or the correlator isn't working right. And that I was wondering if the reason you contradicted the doctrine was because you told me earlier that you would use one eye and then use another. So you were basically training both eyes so that you, during the plastic period, you did the right things as opposed to what most people do. You talk about they go 15 degrees off, put it on the blind spot, turn one eye off, and then that eye just doesn't get trained, and that's why they never do recover. And is this?
Well,
Does this make
yeah, this makes absolute sense. What you're talking about, where somebody always uses the same eye for fixation and always turns the other, causes the condition strabismic amblyopia, which is sometimes commonly termed lazy eye. But actually, there are several different reasons why somebody can lose vision in one eye, which seems to be brain-related. That is, they didn't lose vision because there's a problem with the eye itself, the cornea or the lens or something, or the retina. And so what you're talking about is a condition called strabismic amblyopia. And you're right, if you alternate, like I did, alternating strabismus, then the acuity in both eyes stays relatively good for both eyes. If you if you use only one eye for fixation and turn in the other, become an amblyopic, then the acuity in one eye goes way down. But it actually, past the critical period, that also can be greatly improved. And you can get it back. I'm not saying it's easy, but you can. And there are also these intriguing stories. I know one man who this happened to him, strabismic amblyopia, like I just described, and then he lost vision in his good eye. And in a large percentage of cases where that happens, vision in the amblyopic eye, which could be pretty awful, can sometimes recover all the way back up to 20/20. So it's as if the brain has suppressed that input all these years, but when forced to use it, it can come back. This doesn't happen in every case, but it happens in enough of the cases to make one realize that that eye is not completely unsalvageable. And now that scientists have finally embraced the idea that vision can improve past the critical period, and maybe they can change the name of the critical period to something a little less critical, call it a sensitive period or the period of maximum plasticity. Once people realize that, there are studies that are called perceptual learning studies. And guess what they found? Gee, if you take a person who has a weak eye and amblyopia, and you do specific exercises with that eye, it improves. And so you can bring back the acuity, and probably what's even more important is teaching the person how to coordinate the two eyes together. Because if you don't do that, even if you bring back acuity in the amblyopic eye, but the two eyes still aren't working together, you're going to lose that acuity again, because you're not using it. So you have to teach the person how to use the two eyes together. Yeah?
What makes somebody one eye dominant?
Many of us, probably most of us, have an eye that is dominant. And it's actually a very confusing topic. So for example, you may have one eye that's dominant for certain viewing distances and the other eye dominant for other viewing distances. So it varies from person to person, and from condition to condition, which eye may be dominant. You can all do this test. You can take your arms and make a little window with them, like this, and then look at a very distant object, smallish object like the clock or something, and then close one eye and then the other. And the image should jump when you close one of the eyes and should not jump when you close the other. You have to look in the distance. Because what you're trying to do is make the window so narrow that basically only one eye can look through it at any moment. Yeah? And then you'll if you close one eye and the image jumps, that means that was your dominant eye for that viewing distance. I don't know what makes an eye a dominant eye.
When a child is young and they're having trouble, and you're concerned that maybe they go flat the rest of their life, has anybody ever tried putting a patch over the dominant eye to force the?
Yeah,
to turn up?
they've been doing that for 200 years.
Does it work?
Didn't work for me.
I would say they're better approaches, but that is the standard of care, but it's not the best approach from everything that I've seen. And the reason is this, that usually when a child is suppressing one eye, the problem is not the eye itself, the problem is with binocularity. They don't know how to use the two eyes together. Train them how to use the two eyes together, and they will use the two eyes together, and the acuity in that eye will get better. So if you patch the good eye and you let the weak eye, force the weak eye to do all the visual processing, you'll bring up its acuity. But then when you stop patching, at least the records show that about, I forget now, is it 30%? A good percentage of kids whose acuity has gone up in the weak eye lose that ability. And it's right, because you're not getting at the basic problem. The basic problem is binocular coordination. It's not the acuity of the eye alone. So you've got to get the eyes to work in a binocularly correlated way to solve the problem. Yeah?
One vision therapist used Moreau reflex training as part of the
Yeah.
Can you comment on
Primitive reflexes? Yeah, I can comment on it. So here's, if you are, like I was, an infantile esotrope, it means that something went wrong in those first months of life because you didn't develop normal binocular vision. So then the question becomes, is it just your vision that was affected, or are there other probes you can use to see if there were other neurological problems that went along with it? Subtle ones. Not, obviously not something as severe, let's say, as cerebral palsy or something like that, but subtle ones. And sometimes when you start looking, you look at what are the primitive reflexes, the infant reflexes like the Moreau reflex. These reflexes are prominent in babies. And then as you grow up and learn new motor skills, they become sort of in the background. You don't use them anymore. And so if you take a patient and you test to see if they still are using primitive reflexes, then it may be an indication, again, that during that developmental period when binocular vision wasn't developing normally, there were other neurological things not developing normally as well. And then, the thought might be, maybe if we work on those reflexes as well as the vision, try to get better bilaterality into a person, maybe that'll help. So that's where I think that approach comes from. It's an intriguing idea. Yeah?
So I don't have stereo vision, but I seem to have more peripheral vision than other people.
Because you're exotropic. One eye goes out?
Probably. I think if I'm tired, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I seem to have it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that's normal? Because you said you had less peripheral vision.
Yeah, because you may have, I had esotropia, which meant that when I looked with one eye, the other eye turned in. If you have exotropia, that means when you look with one eye, the other eye turns out. And you may be taking in, so that, if you think about it, gives you a wider visual field, right? If you combine both eyes, you've got a wider visual field. And so then you are able, then you have a wider visual field. So the fact is then you might see more peripherally than a person who has straight eyes. And in fact, sometimes when surgery is done on a person with exotropia, the eye turning out, they are upset because after the surgery, they no longer have this wider peripheral field because that other eye has been sort of more turned in as well. There's I can't remember his name, but he's the leading base stealer ever in baseball. And he had this condition, an intermittent exotropia, where he could turn in his eyes and see in 3D and use that to hit the baseball. But when he was on the bases, he could both look at the picture and look elsewhere at the same time. He could diverge his eyes in that way with this exotropia, and thereby, have a better view of the world and steal those spaces. So, so there may be advantages to that way of seeing.
No, I'm sometimes joking that if I could get stereo vision, I'm not sure I would want it, because I have several aspects where the eyes work better than
And that's,
with
yeah.
other people. So.
Right, and so then it really does become a question of, it's a trade-off. And to get the stereo vision, even if you, let's say, you'd have to work at it. But if you can do both, and some can, they can pull in their eyes and then let them go out, then it could work. But usually if you're in that situation, it takes more effort to pull in your eyes than normal. And so it's more effort to see in 3D.
Right.
And so you're less likely to want to do it. Yeah.
I understand there are these things called saccades. And
Yeah, rapid eye movements.
I think I'm looking at the Space Shuttle there, but what's really happening is my eyes are going pop, 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 pop
Right.
every 50, 100 milliseconds or so, and they're probably basically filling up a poster board of evidence. Well, anyway, my first question is, do those saccades happen same time in both eyes, so their eyes are hopping together? And second, I was just wondering if in the case of somebody with strabismus, when they're young, if maybe that's not working. And is there any evidence? That seems to be a very easy thing to measure and
Right.
observe. And
Right.
Is it the case?
Well, if you look at saccades, saccades can be of two types. Conjugate or disconjugate. Conjugate would mean both eyes going in the same direction at the same time. So you're watching a tennis match and both eyes swivel to the right when the ball goes to the right, and both eyes swivel to the left when the ball goes to the left, right, and left, and right, and left. That's a conjugate saccade. And I don't think there's any evidence to indicate that that's not normal in somebody with strabismus. When you make a vergence movement, turning in both eyes to see something close or turning them out to see something further away, that actually takes much more time than a rapid saccade. And by the way, saccades are the very fastest movements we can make, period. Conjugate saccades. So when you're turning in your eyes or turning them out, it takes more time. Those are also a kind of saccade, and those are not normal in somebody with strabismus. In fact, they may not be existent.
That's the whole point.
Yeah, and those are not normal. That's basically what I learned to train. And my fusion ranges are wonderful in terms of what I can fuse, but it does take me longer than average to go from looking close to looking far, to make the vergence movements back and forth. So, still working on that. One last question?
One last question. So I have pretty normal vision, except that I'm nearsighted. But it's harder for me, and I think for most people, to have good depth perception at dusk.
Mm-hmm.
And possibly also at dawn, but I'm not as often awake at dawn, so I don't have as much data on that one. But I was wondering why that is.
I think because you add up all the cues you use. And so at dusk, light is dimmer. You have, there are monocular cues to depth. Perspective, object occlusion. I know, for example, that, if my hand is blocking my view of the video camera, I know my hand's in front of the video camera. Object occlusion. Perspective, motion parallax, shading, and shadows give you a sense of roundness and depth. Those all come from one eye. And you combine those with your sense of stereo depth to see. And so as those cues begin to fade, because the light is beginning to fade, your depth perception is going to go down.
It seems odd, though, that it's actually better at night.
Your depth perception is, you're saying
So,
it's...
like, if I'm playing tennis with my dad, for example, and it's getting to be evening, and, so there's still light. You can still see, I can still see the net, I can still see the lines on the court, and I suck. And then it gets dark, and there's a light on the court. And
I see what you're saying.
then
You're
I can
getting
see.
better.
Then I get better.
My guess would be it's because the light is coming in obliquely and casting shadows as a result of its obliqueness, and you're taking real advantage of that and combining that with your stereo vision to see better. That would be my guess as to what's going on. Because I've noticed that too. not so much playing tennis, but if I'm looking like at a tree that's in the dark, but there's a street light casting light on the tree at an angle, I'll get this incredible sense of depth now from it, which I think is a combination of the oblique light coming in, setting up certain shading and shadows, combined with my stereo, and it gives me this like wonderful sense of depth. And maybe that's what you're getting. So take a look and see what the lighting situation is like.
I have a tennis thing too. The light, no, but
Yeah.
since I don't have stereo vision, I only estimate where the friggin' ball is by the angle at which it moves. So the light that's coming in and how many light sources there are plays a big role.
Right, because you're using that oblique light. Yeah, right. And I found when I was stereo blind, the worst thing was having to climb down outside steps at noon. You know why? Because the light is directly overhead, there are no shadows. And so everything flattens out, especially if you don't have stereo vision. So, people have asked me for advice about when you're stereo blind. I said, don't try to walk down steps at high noon. Yeah. Thank you.